anyone ever bared their soul to you? Raise your hand. Has anyone ever told you a secret that they've never told anyone else before? Okay, so you know in that moment, when they're doing that, and maybe they start to cry, their eyes light up, and time starts to stand still, and you're watching them in all of their humanness. And you think to yourself, my God, they've never looked more beautiful in their life. It's witnessing people at their most raw. For me, it's a divine moment. And I get to do that every day in my job. It's amazing. So the last time I was here, I graduated almost 17 years ago to the day from this college. And the last memory I have is literally sitting out on that quad, listening to former President Jimmy Carter give his keynote address. After Trinity, I decided to get a Master's of Fine Arts in Nonfiction Creative Writing from Columbia, and then I did my Master's in Social Work from NYU because I realized early on that a writer's life and a therapist's life are beautifully entwined. At the heart of both professions are people's stories, and I love listening to people's stories. In my job, when people come into my office, I get to ask questions like, did you have that affair? Are you pregnant? I even sometimes shop for boys online with my patients, I'm going to admit it, on Tinder. I do, because who's better at picking out your boyfriend than your therapist? So, I've had a private practice now for 10 years in New York City, and I calculated the other day, I've listened to 15,600 hours of people's life stories. 15,600 hours of trudging around knee-deep in people's psyche. That's 10 years of primary research on the human soul. And after doing this work for about 5 years, I realized there's really only 4 things anyone ever talks to me about. That's love, sex, fear, and money. And the funny thing is, depending on the person who's in your office, you can move those words around like little refrigerator magnets. Some fear love, some fear sex, some love sex, some love money, some have sex for money. It happens. And despite what people think they're coming into my office to be treated for, the thing I see the most is depression and anxiety, which makes sense given the current statistics in America. So anxiety disorders affect 40 million Americans a year. Major depressive disorder is the leading cause of disability in the US. And mental illness costs in America are $193.2 billion in lost earnings per year. So what does all this mean? This means we lose a lot of time and money because of our depression and anxiety. And we spend a lot of time and money trying to treat it. So when I saw these statistics put together about a year ago, I asked myself, what the hell are we all doing? Why are some of us not thriving? Which led me to ask the question, what makes us thrive? And then I said, if my life depended on it, could I answer that question with just one word? And thus began a year of obsessing to try to find the answer. That girl up front is looking at me like, you really need life. So, what did I do? How did I find this answer as a psychotherapist? I went to the heart of my work, which is my patients. And I divided them up into 2 categories, right? I put them into a category of those who were thriving and then those who weren't thriving. And then I sat with their stories. I looked over their patient notes, and I thought about it for a really long time. And the question that I kept asking myself was, what are our souls craving? What are we all reaching for, or what are we all afraid of? What, in all those hours of listening to people's stories, were they trying to tell me? And what I realized early on in my research was that my patients who were thriving could embrace intimacy. That's the one word that kept coming up for me. They could harness intimacy. They could figure out how to get more intimacy into their lives, especially in the categories of love and sex, which makes sense, but also money. And in large part, it was because they were so intimate with their own fears. My patients who weren't thriving, they couldn't embrace intimacy into their lives, and they were having a disproportionate amount of depression and anxiety. But still, then I sat back and something wasn't right for me. I was scared to say that intimacy was a thing that makes us thrive. And the reason I was is because the definition of intimacy that I was using was too narrow. The scope was too narrow. Right? Because I always thought of intimacy as having to do with human relationships. But then I went back to the root of the word, like a good wordsmith, and I looked at the definition again, and my whole idea of intimacy changed. I was able to rethink the power of intimacy. So here's the definition. A close familiar relationship and deep understanding with someone or something. That was the key for me. A body of knowledge, right? So we know that intimacy has to do with love and sex, because if you're intimate with your mind and your body and your partners, you're going to have a healthier love life. And we know that intimacy has to do with our relationships with our family and our friends and our coworkers and our children. But intimacy can actually be a part of so many aspects of your life. Think about how many people have dedicated their entire lives to having a more intimate relationship with God and how much pleasure that gives them. When you are creative, you are being intimate. When you pick up an instrument, when you paint, when you write. But you are also experiencing intimacy with your job. What would happen to your life if you had more intimacy with your work? I would argue that you wouldn't just derive more pleasure from it, you would actually make more money. Because I've treated a lot of very well-adjusted people who didn't need much human connection at all to thrive. They took such deep pleasure in their research or their writing or their art. And let's face it, the people that we're attracted to in this society, the people that really move us, seem as if they're not afraid to dive into intimacy. They seem as if they've packed intimacy into every single corner of their lives. And when we watch those people perform, we are inspired. Think of Meryl Streep, Roger Federer, Bob Dylan, Steve Jobs. And if any of you can think of a politician who seems to act with an open heart, let me know after this talk, because I really couldn't think of one. For me, after a year of obsessing about this, I realized that intimacy is the cornerstone to living a remarkable life. So, it makes sense then to argue, if we up our intimacy levels in our lives, right? We up our happiness level. What I always tell my patients, your happiness baseline. And that improves the quality of your life. So the equation looks like this. It's very simple. Up your intimacy, up your happiness. Now, how did this reframe my job? This new understanding that I had come to. I realized that a large part of my job for all these years is to help people tolerate intimacy, right? Now, how do I do this? How do I lower their depression and anxiety by teaching them to tolerate intimacy? So what I do is I teach some mind shifts. What's a mind shift? A mind shift is a change of perspective. So I'm going to teach you 4 mind shifts today that my patients find really helpful. I love this one. I love that photograph. This one I learned from the Navy SEALs. Get comfortable being uncomfortable. We have to realize that our starting place in life is that life is hard, right? So many times patients come into my office and they say, Nell, you have to get rid of my depression and anxiety. And I say, okay, I can do that if I give you a lobotomy. But I can't give you a lobotomy, and I don't even think they do that anymore. Some level of stress in our lives is normal, necessary, and needed. The problem is if we have too many unknowns in our lives, like, am I going to get that job, or am I going to find the love of my life? Or maybe we have a lot of scary medical news coming our way, we panic. A fight or flight response trigger gets pushed. And so what do? Most of us try to fix the problem right away and we make bad decisions. Or we try to numb the problem. In America, we're great at numbing the problem. We shop. I swear that photo's my inside voice at Bloomingdale's, by the way. Right? We drink. Or we eat. That statistic is amazing to me. 1/3 of all US adults are obese. My patients who thrive, they don't press the panic button. They take a second. They learn how to get comfortable with their uncomfortable circumstances so they can make decisions from a mentally stronger place. Because they realize something very key, that sometimes the only thing we can control about a situation is our perception. And I know that's really scary for anybody who is controlling in this audience. I'm one of them who's type A, I got it. But sometimes the only thing you can control in a situation is your perception. The second one, stop the amnesia. So you know how we always hear that phrase, history repeats itself? Why does that happen? I need to hear a TED Talk on why that happens. Right? It's this like human phenomenon I don't understand. But I see it all the time in my office. Patients come in and they're in a panic and they're looking at me and they say, well, I don't know what to do. And I ask them, okay, well, what have you done in the past? And all of a sudden, there's this relief that comes over them. And they can actually remember how they've coped with adversity in the past. Because here's the point, you are stronger than you think you are. And you can't forget that. Remember how you've coped with adversity. This one I love, bounce back. The most important thing I want a patient to know after they leave my office is probably this. You need to be resilient in this life. It's the number one thing I try to teach my kids all the time. You have to be resilient. You have to bounce. And I really can't say it much better than Peter Gomes, the late Reverend Peter Gomes said, who was a minister at Harvard. Get used to it, get over it, and get on with it. Go broken. I love this phrase. So, this is really important for the women to hear in the audience, and we hear it all the time, but I think we actually need to hear it every morning when we wake up. You have to go broken in life. And what does that mean? Stop trying to be perfect. You're never going to be perfect. Just show up. People come into my office all the time and they say, I need to take a year to heal. And unless you're in a recovery program, no, you don't. You have to live life while you heal. Because I think people use that as an excuse a lot to socially isolate themselves and not try. And to me, there's really nothing worse than being boring, and when you're perfect, you're boring. And nobody wants to be boring. I know that these mind shifts are easier said than done. And I know this because in my own life, I've had trouble practicing them. So if we're going to talk about intimacy here, I feel like I need to tell you a little bit about myself. Someone recently said to me, intimacy, in to see me. So I'm going to allow you in to see me a little bit. So I have this mom who has never been afraid to give me advice. I'm going to tell you a little story about her. I was having one of my children and I'm in labor and I push out the baby and I'm holding the baby on my chest and it's this beautiful moment and like the heavens have opened and birds are singing, it's like a Disney movie. And everybody leaves the room, it's just my mom and I. And I feel her peering over her glasses looking at me. And I think that she's gonna say something like, thank you, Nell, for bringing another grandchild into this life. And instead she says, I really don't like your hair. Who says that? We all have a mom like that, right? Who gives us advice at the weirdest times. That's my mom. Let me tell you a little backstory about my mom. My mom is from an Irish immigrant home. My grandparents came over from Ellis Island. So she's a baby boomer and she's Irish Catholic, which is a tough combination, right? She's 74 years old and she still works full-time as an oncology nurse at a hospital, an inner city hospital not far from here. She's not here today at this talk because she's working the night shift. She's 74. As my 10-year-old son says to me, Mom, you're never going to compete with that. My mom will be sainted, but hanging out with her is kind of like hanging out with Mother Teresa and Judge Judy all at the same time. There she is. That's Ellen. She's also my hero and my best friend. So, I'm going to disclose another little secret to you. About 3.5 years ago, I was 200 pounds. And I was sitting at lunch with my mom one day, and instead of eating the regular lunch, I was eating that chicken parm dinner special at the diner. And again, I feel her peering over her glasses looking at me. And I look up and I say, what is it, Mom? She puts her hand gently on my hand and she said, Nell, I'm going to give you some advice. I said, what is it, Mom? And she said, get your shit together. It was great advice. I put down that fork, and the next day, I dragged my fat ass to a yoga studio. I put my mat down, and I got really intimate with that yoga mat. And with every handstand, I said, face fear with an open heart. And with every downward dog, I said, you better get comfortable because this weight isn't going to come off very fast. It took a year, but I lost 80 pounds. So then I find myself with my mom again about a year later, and I have to break some news to her, and I start to cry. And I say, Mom, I got to tell you, I think my marriage isn't going to make it. And I have 3 little kids at this point. And I said, this is so shameful for me because I'm a psychotherapist who treats couples. This is not a good tagline for your website, right? I was also scared because I thought, who's ever going to love me again with 3 little kids? That's not a sexy look. My mom stopped me and she said, I have to ask you something now. And I said, what? She said, do you have cancer? So my mom's whole life, because she's an oncology nurse, is framed around cancer. And I said, no, Mom, I don't have cancer. She said, okay, well, I'm sorry for the children, but I want you to get on with it. And then she did something magical. She got out her checkbook and she wrote me a check. And she handed it to me, and I said, what's the check for, Mom? And she said, your first therapy session is on me. And this was a huge moment for me because I had to become the patient again. And I learned a couple really amazing things that year. I learned that being a therapist is the most gut check work you can do. Because when you're giving advice that you're not taking, you are the most inauthentic person in the world. And I always tell my patients, there's the person you are here and the person you present to the world. And all the depression and the anxiety and the junk that's in the space in between, that's where all your pain is. The goal is to close the gap, to live, and I know it sounds cliche, but an authentic life. The second thing I learned was how grateful I was to all the people who had come into my office and who had been brave enough to bare their souls to me. Because as much as they thought I was helping them, they were helping me 1,000-fold. And the third thing I learned is that I'm a total intimacy junkie. And I'll be happy to start a support group after this is over today. For the rest of you who will come out of the closet and tell me you are also intimacy junkies. But I realized that I chose to do this work because it was filled with intimacy. What could be more intimate than listening to people's souls? And for me, the fine art of being a therapist is the dance you do between your clinical knowledge, your ethical boundaries, and just being a person, sitting across the room from another person, having conversations about deeply personal things. I hope that this talk is just the beginning. I hope that these concepts I've brought forward today help people live happier, healthier, better lives. This gets me really excited because I think that the concept of intimacy can have much broader social applications. So I want us right now to go from a place of thinking about you, to us, to all of us, to what we can get individually, to what we can give collectively if we make intimacy a bigger part of our lives. Intimacy is not about merging with another. It's not about surrender. Disagreements lead to greater intimacy because when you disagree with someone, you're being honest about who you are and how you feel and what you need. You're allowing yourself to be seen and you're allowing another person to be heard. Imagine a world where more parents knew how to teach their children about intimacy. Imagine a world where we didn't avoid intimacy with our children because we were so overworked, or we overscheduled them, or we didn't allow them to face some adversity on their own because we made them too comfortable. I would argue that those children would grow up to become stronger, more compassionate adults. And compassion is a key component of intimacy because without compassion for yourself or your fellow man, if you're too critical or you're too judgmental, you can't experience intimacy. True intimacy comes from respecting another person's point of view. We need to be able to stand next to what makes us uncomfortable to grow. When we stand next to what we find different from us, we are one step closer to breaking down the barriers that separate us and hold us back as human beings. If we get intimate with the lifestyles and the ideologies of the things that make us uncomfortable, we have more compassion for our fellow man. We understand the depth of his story. We can dive deep. We have the ability to hold steady. And we have not only learned individual tolerance of the mind, but social tolerance as well. And that elevates all of humanity. Rich next to poor, gay next to straight, men next to women, old next to young, Christian next to Muslim, we have a shot of raising us all up. Jimmy Carter, on my graduation day, asked us to end injustice, fight poverty, and promote peace, even if at times it makes us uncomfortable. I've never forgotten that moment. Not long after he said those words, he won the Nobel Peace Prize. And now I understand, 17 years later, why he ended his speech with the word love. Thank you.